They called the cops on me for fishing in my own lake on my own ranch. Claimed I was violating HOA water rules. But here's what they didn't know. That little call triggered a clause in their agreement with the county, one that put them on the hook for a $50,000 penalty. All because they tried to flex on the wrong person in the wrong place. Some folks dream of lakefront property. Me? I was born into it. I didn't just buy land with a lake on it. I inherited it. Every acre, every fence post, every smooth stone at the bottom of the shoreline has history behind it. Not from some catalog or real estate pitch, but from blood, sweat, and time. My family's been on this land for decades. We're not flashy. We don't put up big signs. But we know what we own, and more importantly, we take care of it. That lake? It's not just decoration. It's part of the ranch. Stocked with largemouth bass and bluegill, monitored every season, and aerated to keep things clean. It's fed by 2 natural springs and held in place by a dam my grandfather and uncles helped reinforce back in the 80s. I've spent more days sitting on that dock with a coffee in one hand and a rod in the other than I could ever count. This land doesn't need much. It asks only that you respect it. And I do. I live alone out here. By choice, not circumstance. Mornings start early. Chores get done with quiet determination. When you're used to nature being your neighbor, you don't go looking for noise. So when the nearby area started seeing development about 6 years ago, I didn't raise a fuss. I figured people needed homes. The city grew. Suburbia started curling in closer. Then came the trucks. Graders. Contractors. They carved up what used to be empty pasture just north of my property and planted a cul-de-sac and homes with matching mailboxes. Soon after, they started an HOA. Of course, I wasn't part of it, legally or socially. My property predates their deed filings by decades. My lake sits fully on my ranch's land, surrounded by fence lines and stone markers you could trace on county maps. I knew where their boundaries ended and where mine began. I figured they'd do the same. And to their credit, most folks respected that. At first, there was some curiosity. A few of the newer neighbors waved when I drove by on my tractor. One even dropped off a basket of zucchini and said it was part of a neighborhood outreach. Nice enough people. But like any group of houses with too much time and too many rules, eventually someone steps up to lead, and it's almost always the wrong person. Her name was Karen. No, really. That was actually her name. And if you've lived near any HOA long enough, you already know the type. She spoke in clipped sentences, always holding a clipboard, and wore a whistle around her neck during walking patrols. Her garden was perfectly trimmed, her voice perfectly shrill, and her respect for other people's boundaries? Non-existent. Karen didn't just live next to the rules. She lived to enforce them, even if she had to make them up. It started small, of course. One spring, she left a note on my mailbox reminding me that unlicensed signage isn't allowed in front yards. I didn't have any signs. Turns out she meant the hand-painted fresh eggs for sale board I'd propped up by the dirt road. Another time, she waved me down while I was clearing brush and tried to lecture me on noise ordinances. I told her I wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. She smiled and said, "We'll see about that." But mostly, I ignored her. I figured she was just playing queen of her castle. As long as she kept her nonsense inside her own fence, I wasn't going to waste time on confrontation. The lake was my peace. I'd fish there a few times a week, usually in the early morning, sometimes just before sunset. Catch and release mostly, though once in a while I'd keep a base for the grill. It was a ritual, one of the last things in life no one had tried to regulate. That is, until Karen saw me casting a line one Saturday afternoon and decided she had a problem with it. I was on the far dock, tucked into a shaded corner of the water, when I heard her voice from across the property line. "Excuse me, sir." I looked up, rod still in hand. She was standing just outside the HOA's decorative gate, arms folded like she just caught someone vandalizing a library. "Are you a resident?" "I live here," I said plainly. "I mean in this community," she said, gesturing toward the HOA. "Nope," I said. "I live on the land this lake is part of." "That lake is shared space," she snapped. "It's listed in the HOA brochure. It's part of the community's natural buffer zone." I blinked. "Ma'am, this lake is 100% on my property. It's not shared, not zoned for public access, and not listed in your charter." She rolled her eyes like I was speaking Greek. I'll be contacting the board. You can't just show up and fish wherever you want. I'm not showing up. I never left. You all moved in. This has been mine since long before your HOA existed. She walked away without saying another word. I assumed that was the end of it. I assumed wrong. Because when someone like Karen feels embarrassed, they don't back down. They double down. It was 3 days later. Early morning. I was back at the dock, fishing. The water was glassy. Sunlight just starting to kiss the treetops. It should have been peaceful, until I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked up to see 2 police cruisers rolling down my drive. At first, I thought maybe someone had reported a wreck on the road. Or maybe there was a loose dog causing trouble. But nope, they were here for me. One officer approached calmly, while the other stayed by the car. "Morning, sir. We got a call about possible trespassing on lakefront property. Can we talk?" I almost laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I stood up, reeled in my line, and said, "Sure thing, officer. I've got paperwork." And I did. A folder kept inside the ranch office. Land deed, maps, photos, tax records, all proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the lake sat entirely on my private land. I walked them through it. Calm, respectful, thorough. To their credit, the officers were professional. One of them even said, "Yeah, this all checks out. Looks like someone didn't do their homework." They left. No warning. No citations. No handcuffs. Karen, who had been standing just beyond the hedgerow watching everything unfold, turned and stormed off the moment they looked her way. But for me, it wasn't over. Because it wasn't just about fishing anymore. It wasn't about some busybody yelling at clouds. It was about someone filing a false police report to assert fake authority. It was about an HOA claiming control over land they didn't own. It was about principle. And if there's one thing ranch life teaches you, it's this. You don't let anyone fence you off your own land. You'd think fishing would be the last thing to cause conflict in a neighborhood. It's quiet, peaceful, inoffensive, just a man and a rod and a few hours under the sky. But to Karen, fishing wasn't just a hobby. It was an act of war. It started one late Saturday morning. I had a thermos of coffee in one hand and my favorite rod in the other. The sun was just high enough to warm the surface of the water, and the baits were biting. I was halfway through my second cast when I heard footsteps approaching from behind the tree line near the boundary fence. 2 women, HOA board members I recognized from previous flyers, came walking up with clipboards and tight smiles. Karen was trailing just behind them, already squinting in judgment. "Sir," one of them called out, as if I were a misbehaving student. "Yes," I said, not bothering to put down the rod. "Are you aware that this lake is designated as a shared-use zone for Pine Hollow HOA?" I almost laughed right then. "No, I'm aware that this lake is on my ranch, has been for 40 years. Karen cut in, arms folded. "It's listed in our HOA brochure under scenic access for all residents." "Then your brochure is lying," I replied calmly. "Because this water, this dock, that shoreline, all on my deed, not shared, not scenic, not yours." The other 2 women glanced at each other. Karen's eyes narrowed. That's not the attitude of someone who wants to be a good neighbor. "You don't need attitude when you have title paperwork," I said. "Feel free to look it up at the county office." Karen didn't say another word, just turned on her heel and walked off without so much as a "have a nice day." I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, I went back to the dock around 7:30. The lake was glassy. Fog still hovered over the surface. It was perfect. I just cast out when I heard the rumble of tires on gravel. I looked over my shoulder and saw something I hadn't expected. 2 police cruisers rolling down the main ranch road. Now, law enforcement isn't uncommon out here. Sometimes they check on livestock complaints or stop by for a coffee break on lawn patrols. But this time felt different. Both cruisers parked just shy of my fence line, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out. One older, clearly the senior of the 2, and one younger, clipboard in hand. They approached slowly, hands relaxed but alert. "Morning, sir," the older one called. "Can we have a quick word?" "Sure," I said, standing up and resting the rod against the dock post. "Everything okay? We got a call from a local HOA. Said someone might be trespassing or fishing without community permission. On this lake, I asked, raising an eyebrow. That's what they said. Said a non-resident was seen repeatedly fishing off their community lakefront. I see. I walked back toward the main house without another word, motioned for them to follow. Inside, I grabbed a red file folder from the top drawer of my desk, one I'd prepared after the first conversation with Karen. Inside was my official land deed, county zoning map clearly showing the lake within my property, photos of boundary markers, a maintenance plan from the environmental agency showing it as a private water feature, a utility bill linked to the dock's electricity. I handed the folder to the older officer. He flipped through it carefully, nodding slowly. Looks pretty clear to me. Because it is, I said, Karen thinks she can rewrite geography. The younger officer looked a bit embarrassed. Sorry about the disruption. Mind if we just get a photo of your ID to log the interaction? No problem. I handed it over, and after a quick scan, they both nodded and turned to leave. Appreciate your cooperation, sir. Sorry for the inconvenience. No harm done, I said. But I'd suggest talking to your caller about what the term trespassing actually means. They chuckled, and just like that, the cruisers rolled off and the gravel road returned to stillness. Now, I expected the police visit to be the climax of Karen's nonsense. I was wrong, because a week later, I got a phone call from a confused local realtor asking if I was still offering public lake access or not, because the HOA had included it in their welcome packet. Excuse me? I asked them to send me a copy of what they'd received. Sure enough, there it was. Page 6 of the Pine Hollow, Welcome to the Neighborhood brochure. Enjoy shared lakefront living. All residents of Pine Hollow enjoy scenic access to nearby water for fishing, kayaking, and peaceful walks. With a big photo of my dock, my fence, my lake. That's when it became clear this wasn't just an argument over a dock. This was a full-blown campaign of false authority, and it wasn't just annoying anymore. It was fraud. Karen wasn't just pushing boundaries. She was advertising access to something she didn't own. She was collecting dues from new homeowners, using my property as a selling point, and tried to enforce imaginary rules through police involvement. And she almost got away with it, because most folks never question a confident liar with a clipboard. But that's where she made her mistake. Because if there's one thing more powerful than a loud neighbor with opinions, it's a quiet man with a deed and time to burn. Once the officers left my property with apologies instead of citations, I realized something critical. Karen wasn't just annoying anymore. She was dangerous. Because when someone calls the cops on you for being on your own land, and then doubles down by distributing promotional materials to neighbors claiming that same land as community access, it's not just a misunderstanding. It's a campaign, and I had to shut it down. I started with the welcome packet. The real estate agent had been kind enough to send over a scanned PDF of the Pine Hollow HOA's new resident orientation booklet. It had a smiling family on the cover and a quote about neighborhood harmony. But page 6 was where things got interesting. There was again a full-color photo of my lake, my dock, and my property with a caption, "Enjoy exclusive lake access as part of your HOA lifestyle. Ideal for kayaking, casual fishing, and family gatherings. No asterisque, no disclaimer, no fine print." I almost admired the boldness until I flipped to the financial section. Line item number 4 under monthly dues allocation. Lakefront maintenance, $37.50 per month. Excuse me? They weren't just claiming access. They were charging for it. Karen and her HOA board were collecting dues under the pretense that they were maintaining a lake they didn't own, didn't manage, and didn't have a single legal right to touch. Worse, they were using it as a sales feature. I pulled up a few online listings from properties in their subdivision and found phrases like, steps from private stocked, lake access, waterfront, HOA living, ranch lake just a walk away, perfect for weekend fishing. It wasn't just false advertising. It was monetized fraud. And suddenly, this wasn't just about Karen being overbearing. This was civil harassment, property misrepresentation, and potentially criminal overreach. So I got to work. Every evening, after the chores were done, I pulled together documentation. My deed, clearly showing the lake, shoreline, and surrounding land as part of my property. Zoning and plat maps from the county assessor's office. Archived aerial images, proving the lake had existed long before the HOA was founded. Screenshots from HOA emails and real estate sites referencing lake access. Receipts and maintenance logs, proving I alone paid for the upkeep, fish stocking, algae treatment, dock repair, and more. A copy of the HOA welcome packet, featuring my property without permission. Then I took it all and called a lawyer. His name was Davis. Sharp, slow-talking, and dangerous in court. Exactly the kind of man you want in your corner when dealing with people who confuse arrogance with authority. I handed him the folder. He took his time reading through it. Didn't speak for 20 minutes. Then he leaned back and said, "They're going to regret touching your water." Within a week, we filed a formal legal complaint. 2 parts, cease and desist, demanding the immediate removal of all images, language, and dues charges related to the lake from all HOA materials and communications. Civil action filing for misrepresentation, unauthorized commercial use of private property, and repeated civil harassment, backed by the 911 report, HOA emails, and real estate listings using my lake as a sales point. But we didn't stop there. Davis had a contact in the local assessor's office. We requested a full audit of the HOA's records, focusing on any permits, easements, or usage rights they may have claimed over the years. We found none, not a single easement request, no legal tie between the HOA and the lake, no access right filed, no shared ownership established. In fact, their boundary line, clearly marked and surveyed by the county years ago, ended a full 35 feet short of my southern fence. The lake wasn't even near their land, legally speaking. They were just close enough to pretend. And in court, close enough gets laughed out of the room. The most damning piece? A community newsletter sent out a few months prior, signed by Karen herself, celebrating the HOA's continued stewardship of our beautiful lakefront environment. She actually had the nerve to thank volunteers for clearing trail access to the dock. My dock. That one made it into the exhibits list. Davis included it as Exhibit 12, admission of unlawful access and trespass encouragement. As word got around that a legal case was being assembled, the HOA board started to squirm. Emails that used to arrive weekly slowed down. Flyers disappeared. Karen's once frequent neighborhood updates stopped appearing in mailboxes. But it was too late for that. Because legal momentum, once it's in motion, doesn't care about how nervous someone looks. Especially not someone who called the cops on a man fishing in his own backyard. Davis set up a mediation session. Karen showed up with a tight bun, a thick folder, and a visibly overwhelmed HOA attorney who looked like he'd been briefed 5 minutes before walking in. I watched her try to explain how community expectations and shared visual space gave her board the right to promote the lake as a passive amenity. Davis didn't even flinch. You promoted a private asset. You charged for its use. You used the police to enforce a right you never had. He laid down every document, every screenshot, every map. Kyle unfolded fust. Their lawyer asked to caucus. 30 minutes later, they came back with an offer. A full retraction, a public apology to be sent to all HOA members, and a settlement totaling $50,000 to cover damages, legal fees, and the cost of updated signage. I didn't even blink. At a notarized acknowledgement of the property boundary to be filed with the county, and we've got a deal. Done. Karen's face turned the color of boiled lobster as she signed the paperwork. It was over. Just like that, the HOA's imaginary lake became what it always had been. Mine. The mediation room wasn't some grand courtroom with a jury box and a judge's gavel, but it may as well have been. There was a long oak table, 2 pitchers of water, a court-appointed mediator with a neutral expression, and a small crowd of HOA representatives flanking Karen, who sat front and center like she was still in charge of something. On my side, just me, my lawyer Davis, and a manila folder that had already given them more sleepless nights than they cared to admit. I wasn't there to gloat. I wasn't even angry, but I was done being quiet. The mediator opened the session with the usual legal disclaimers. Neutrality, binding terms, confidentiality unless otherwise required by court order. Then he asked both sides to state their claims. Karen's lawyer went first. He tried to sound composed, but his voice kept flickering, like he was just realizing how deep into this mess his client had dragged him. He used words like misunderstanding, intent, and community perception. He referenced gray areas in property access and historic visual use of the lake. But Davis didn't let slide. When it was our turn, he leaned forward, flipped open the folder, and laid out our opening. This isn't a gray area. This is black and white. The lake is 100% on my client's deeded land. It is not included in any HOA charter, plat, or easement. The HOA not only claimed control of it without cause, but used it to promote sales, collect dues, and falsely involve law enforcement in an act of intimidation. He pulled out the first exhibit, a printed aerial map, dated and signed by the county assessor's office, with the lake neatly outlined in red. This map has been on file with the county for over 20 years. Every inch of that water belongs to him. He placed it on the table, turned it toward the mediator, then toward the opposing lawyer. Karen didn't look at it. She stared at the table like it might somehow crack open and swallow her. Next came the emails, the welcome packet, the newsletter with her signature at the bottom, the police report confirming she had called 911 to report a trespasser when the supposed trespasser was standing on land he legally owned, fishing off a dock he paid to build. Davis placed the police report down with quiet precision. They filed a knowingly false complaint. That's not just a mistake. That's weaponized authority. The mediator raised an eyebrow and glanced toward Karen. Ms. Bennett, he said, do you dispute the accuracy of these documents? Karen cleared her throat. We were working with an understanding of... No, ma'am, Davis interrupted. You were working with assumptions, and you used those assumptions to target a property owner outside your jurisdiction. I was told. You were told by yourself, he said, finally raising his voice slightly. Because you were the president. You created the narrative. And you caused real damages, reputational, financial, and legal. Silence followed. Even her own board members, who had come in wearing stiff polos and HOA pins, started shifting in their seats. Some crossed their arms. One woman looked like she might be regretting ever running for anything. Finally, the mediator spoke. Given the evidence, I find that the HOA misrepresented access rights, included private property in promotional materials without consent, and falsely reported lawful behavior as criminal activity. This caused undue burden and reputational harm to the property owner. He looked at both sides. We can settle this through formal judgment or mediation. If this moves to court, the damages could increase significantly. Karen's lawyer leaned in, whispered frantically. She whispered back. There was visible tension. She didn't want to agree. That much was obvious. But she also didn't want this going to trial, where public records and local news could make her the poster child for HOA overreach. They folded. The final agreement was signed that afternoon. A full retraction to be mailed to all HOA residents, clearly stating that the lake was private and always had been. Immediate removal of any and all references to the lake in promotional, financial, or internal HOA materials. A public apology to be read aloud at the next HOA meeting. And a financial settlement of $50,000 to cover legal fees, damages, and compensation for reputational harm. It was done. I walked out of that room with a copy of the signed agreement in my hand and a very calm, very satisfied kind of smile on my face. Not because I'd won, but because I'd ended it by the book. They played games. I played facts. And in the end, facts cashed the check. But the fallout didn't stop at the table. Word spread fast. At the next HOA meeting, where Karen was scheduled to deliver her public apology, the room was packed. Neighbors who had once blindly followed her walked in with arms crossed and skeptical eyes. She stood at the podium, face pale, and read from a prepared statement. The Pine Hollow HOA Board would like to acknowledge a misrepresentation of local property boundaries in previous publications. We regret any confusion caused by this error and formally recognize that the lake bordering our neighborhood is privately owned and not under HOA jurisdiction. It went on, dry, emotionless, but the crowd wasn't fooled. A few people applauded, sarcastically. One man in the back muttered, "Guess we're not kayaking this weekend." Someone else snorted and said, $50,000 to learn how to read a map. Karen tried to save face afterward, walked around shaking hands, muttering about corrective measures and miscommunication. But the damage was done. Her authority? Gone. Her credibility? Vaporized. By the next month's board election, she didn't even bother running again. She knew better. Her name stayed on one mailbox. But inside those walls, her grip on the neighborhood had vanished. And as for the lake, I installed a new sign at the base of the dock. Not aggressive, not sarcastic, just 5 clean words on cedarwood. Private waters. Trespassers pay twice. By the time the dust settled, the neighborhood looked a little different, not in structure, but in energy. Karen was gone. Well, not physically gone. She still lived in the same house with the perfectly symmetrical rose bushes and 2 American flags out front. But her clipboard was retired, her flyers were gone, and her seat at the HOA table had been quietly vacated. She didn't put up a fight. She didn't even show up for the vote. Maybe she thought it was better to vanish into silence than to face another room full of neighbors who now saw through the smile. The new HOA leadership was surprisingly normal. No more lake access language. No more shared amenities talk. At the next board meeting, the new president, a retired schoolteacher named Linda, who preferred lemonade over power trips, brought homemade cookies and started the session with, "Let's begin by making sure we're only managing what we're supposed to manage." The room actually laughed. That was the turning point. No more drama. No more whispers. Just a neighborhood of people who'd learned what happens when someone overreaches and what happens when someone else finally and legally pushes back. The lake, of course, remained mine. Now, though it was clearly marked, boundary stakes reinforced, new signage added at both entrances. I didn't want to be confrontational, just clear. At the base of the dock, right where the walkway meets the first wooden plank, I installed a small handmade sign. Nothing aggressive, just a little wink. Fishing allowed, property owner only. It made people laugh when they saw it. The UPS driver took a picture. Even Linda from a new HOA brought it up once and chuckled. "We might need one of those for the bake sale table," she joked. From then on, the lake stayed quiet. The fish still bit in the early mornings. The frogs still croaked after sunset. But no one came wandering through. No one dared claim shared access. The water became sacred again, not just for me, but for what it represented. A line in the sand that held. A quiet place that stayed protected. A reminder that when you own something, you don't need to raise your voice. You just need to raise your deed. I kept to myself, mostly. Life went back to normal. Fencing repairs. Feed dilly fries. Saturday evenings with a pole in hand and a thermos of strong black coffee beside me. But I noticed something else, too. Neighbors who used to nod stiffly now stopped to chat. One guy brought his kid by just to point out the lake and say, "That's how you stand your ground, the right way." Another offered to help trim some tree limbs that hung over the road near my entrance. There was a shift, not just in how people viewed Karen, but in how they viewed me. And it wasn't fear. It was respect. If your HOA thinks calling the cops will scare you off your own land, remind them, badges follow deeds, not demands. And if they don't check the map before pointing fingers, they might end up paying for it in cash. Because here's the truth most clipboard warriors forget. Ownership isn't just about fences or lakes or docks. It's about facts. And no amount of made-up rules, neighborhood newsletters, or public tantrums will ever outrank a name printed in black and white on a county deed. They thought they could intimidate me with noise. But all it took was quiet paperwork and a good lawyer. So if you ever find yourself facing down an HOA with more bark than brains, don't lose your cool. Don't argue. Don't shout. Just open a folder, point to your boundary line, and let them figure out what it feels like to be out of bounds and out 50 grand. Because when entitlement meets evidence, justice doesn't just arrive, it comes with interest,